Hello, welcome to Chapmanomics with me, Mr. Chapman. Today, we're going to start off looking at a brand new topic, and that is factors and strategies influencing growth and development. This is theme 4 in economics and 4.3 in particular for the Edexcel specification, though this does cover a number of other specifications too. And what we're going to look at is what the factors are that constrain economies and what the strategies are that can try to improve economies when it comes to their economic growth and their economic development. But in order to do that, we need to look over some past knowledge just to make sure that we're all on the same page and we all understand the basics before we go into the more complex stuff. So let's head straight over to the whiteboard and let's see what those basics are. So, firstly, we must understand the difference between economic growth and economic development. Those two are two very different things. And in our exams, if we're asked a question about growth and development, we need to talk on the one hand about economic growth and on the other hand about economic development. We can't just talk about growth and development as if it were the same thing. So let's have a recap of what the difference is. Economic growth is all about increasing the amount of goods and services that a country is producing. So growth is an increase in the value of goods and services produced in an economy. And we can quantify this, right? This is a number. This is quantifiable. I think there's an I in that rather than a Y there. Quantifiable, right? This is something we can put a number on. We can count up the amount of goods and services we produce. We can look at the price. We can times one by the other, and we can get whether or not an economy is growing or shrinking. Economic development, on the other hand, is a very different concept. This is all about the standard of living in an economy. And so as a result, this is a very subjective thing. Your standard of living might be much higher than mine in your opinion, but in my opinion, my standard of living might be higher than yours. This is very subjective as to exactly what a standard of living means. It's a sort of idea of well-being. So it's not quantifiable. Instead, this is a normative idea, right? So if we think back to those ideas of positive and normative statements, we can make positive statements here about economic growth, but we can only make normative statements about economic development because there's no one clear definition of what standard of living means. And as a result, there's no one clear way of measuring it. However, we're economists, so we do love to try and measure whatever we can try to measure. And then we like to use that as a proxy measure, as an approximate measure, as it were, for the thing that we're really trying to measure. So when it comes to development, there are a few ways in which we measure it. And the Edexcel specification in particular, there's a focus on the Human Development Index. And if you remember, the Human Development Index is made up of 3 factors. And the first of those factors is life expectancy. Is our first factor that makes up HDI. And what this is sort of measuring is the level of health in an economy. How healthy we are is a big guide as to what our standard of living is likely to be. If we're an incredibly unhealthy population, if we die very young, then chances are we're not gaining a huge amount of welfare across the period of our lives simply because those lives are shorter. And they're perhaps harsher as well because we're spending a long time ill. The second thing that is measured within our HDI is years of schooling. And years of schooling is kind of measuring your human capital. It's your sort of skill level, really. And it's therefore your ability to access good jobs. It's your ability to access the whole economy. If you are a well-skilled person, if you are well-trained in things, then you can pretty much access any job that you like. And as a result, you're likely to have a higher standard of living because you can get a very well-paid job. You can buy a load of stuff as a result. But this also measures, this standard of this, so years of schooling, also measures your ability to access the economy. So, and the access to your culture. So can you read? Can you write? Can you go and watch a play and understand what's happening in the play? Can you understand the history of your country and these kinds of things? all the stuff that you'll learn at school, as hopefully you guys have done out there. Then the third thing that is a factor that makes up the Human Development Index is GNI per capita. And if you remember, GNI is all about gross national income. It is the total amount of income that individuals and firms receive from the economy. And so what this sort of shows us, because we're doing it per capita, it's that income per capita, is sort of average incomes. It's kind of a close measure of average income. And if you have a very high average income, that means you can buy a load of goods and services. That means that you can buy a new table, a new car, a new bed, a new chest of drawers, a new t-shirt, new hats, whatever you want to buy, you can buy if you have a very high income. And as a result, your standard of living is likely to be a lot higher. You're able to be able to afford healthcare, you're able to be able to afford schooling, you're able to afford the goods and services that you want to buy. So as a result, these three things kind of make up an idea of a standard of living. And these are the three things we can measure in order to put together something that measures something we can't measure. So we can look at life expectancy, years of schooling, and GNI per capita and measure those. The problem, of course, though, is that that's not all of standards of living. This average incomes idea in particular is very problematic, because if you have one person who earns, say, £200 billion a year, just to be silly, and everybody else earns only £1 a year, then your average income, depending obviously on your population, is actually going to be much higher than most people's incomes. So this isn't taking into account things like inequality, but it's also not taking into account ideas of subjective happiness. So you will have likely seen before that money isn't the route to happiness necessarily. It certainly helps, because having a house, for instance, makes you a lot happier than not having a house. But having lots and lots of money, huge amounts of money, does not necessarily make you happy. The extra pound has diminishing returns to it. And as a result, we're not really measuring people's standards of living in terms of their level of happiness through this Human Development Index. So let's have a quick recap of exactly how the HDI works. And if we have a country here with a HDI of 0.67 and country B that has 0.72, which country is more developed and how do we know? Well, remember, the more developed you are, the closer the figure is to the number 1. And so therefore, country B is more developed because 0.72 is closer to 1 than 0.67. And so what this actually means is that in country B, their life expectancy, or their years of schooling, or their GNI per capita, or some combination of these, whatever that combination might be, right? It might be all three, is higher in country B than in country A. And as a result, as economists, we can make a good normative judgment that's backed up by some positive statements that says that country B is more developed than country A. So whenever we are looking at any kind of question to do with growth and development, we want to split that question into two parts. Split it into the growth part and split it into the development part. And growth is all about increasing the value of goods and services in the economy. It's about shifting out AS or shifting out AD or shifting out both. And development, on the other hand, is all about standards of living. So if ever we're going to talk about development, we're always going to focus it on these three factors. We're always going to focus it on increasing HDI. If we do that, we get a lovely way of explaining how exactly a policy or how a factor is going to affect development by explaining how it affects one of these three factors here. And we're always going to be focusing on development as a result. Okay, so that's our first recap done. Let's look at the second part so that we can have a look at when we get to strategies influencing growth and development, we can understand whether we're looking at demand side policies or supply side policies. So what is the difference between demand side policies and supply side policies? Well, demand side policies is trying to stimulate aggregate demand. We're trying to get more demand in the economy. We're trying to increase consumption or investment or government spending or increase exports or decrease imports. That's our demand side policy. Supply side policy, on the other hand, is trying to stimulate aggregate supply. So here we're trying to bring down costs for firms by reskilling the workforce or increasing levels of infrastructure or lowering taxes on corporation tax and those kinds of things. So it's very important that we understand the difference between those two policies, because if we are trying to stimulate AD, then we need a demand side policy. If we are trying to stimulate AS, then we need a supply side policy. And again, this is going to change which curves here we are shifting when it comes to our AS. So our supply side policy is going to shift out AS. Our demand side policy, on the other hand, is going to shift out AD, right? Very simply. So if a country has stagflation, should a country focus on demand side or supply side policy, and why? Now, if we look at stagflation, what stagflation means is that the price level in an economy is rising. So here we have output. Here we have our price level. It means that our price level in the economy is rising, but our economy isn't growing. So if we do that Keynesian curve a little better. I always like to draw a Keynesian curve for our aggregate supply curve. I just think there's always more to talk about when it comes to an exam. So here we have AD1, and here we have AD2, and here we've got exactly the same Y, which is at YFE for both, and we have a price level 1 and a price level 2. And this here is our stagflation, these two. The YFE is staying the same and our price level is rising. So if that's the case, what do we need to do? Well, we need to stimulate the supply side of the economy. We need to shift out AS, which means we're trying to stimulate AS, which means we need a supply side policy. And so as a result, if we shift out our aggregate supply curve here to AS2, then what we get on our AD2 is a much lower price level. But crucially, that increase in economic growth as a result. Finally, we're going to draw an AD-AS model to show the likely effect of a country doubling their investment into education provision for its citizens. Now, if you remember correctly, increasing investment into education is trying to improve the skills in the economy, skill level of the economy, trying to improve the human capital of an economy, and therefore this is going to stimulate aggregate supply. It's going to mean that there are more workers with higher skills available for firms to hire. Therefore, productivity is likely to increase, or simply having more workers available for firms. So therefore, this is going to be another supply side policy. So again, we want to put our Y and our PL to make sure that we always correctly label our models. And this time, let's do it as a classical example. So here's LRAS1. Here's our AD curve. And if they're stimulating investment into education, this is not just simply a short-term fix. This is not pushing the factors of production that we have just past their limit by making workers work overtime and things. Instead, this is a permanent change to the economy. So therefore, what we're going to see here is a shifting out of long-run aggregate supply to LRAS2. So this is going to go out this way, which then is going to bring down our price level from PL1 to PL2, and also increase output from Y to Y1, or you could even do YFE1 to YFE2, given that we are looking at long run aggregate supply on a classical model here. So as a quick recap of what we've just looked at, when we're looking at growth and development, we want to be very clear about the difference between the two. Economic growth, we're going to talk about how can we produce more in the economy, or what's preventing us from producing more in the economy. Economic development, on the other hand, we're going to talk about life expectancy, years of schooling, and GNI per capita. How are those three things constrained, or how are we going to affect those three things? Then finally, we've got to remember the difference between demand side policies that stimulate AD and supply side policies that stimulate AS. And when we're stimulating AD, we want to show shifts in AD. When we're stimulating AS and supply side policy, we want to show a shift in aggregate supply. Next, we're going to start looking at why economists care about growth and development. So here are the three questions that we are going to start looking at. So I'd advise you to pause the video now, give these three questions a go, and I will see you in the next video.